some of the points from Lachish and the Assyrians, and then we will continue with the topic of Jerusalem and the Assyrians. So let's begin. We are here dealing with one of the most dramatic events in ancient history, the events of 701 BCE. Just to situate you in time and space, for those of you who are a little unfamiliar, we've gone through the period of Egypt, we've gone through the arrival of Israel into the land of Israel, the Philistines. We're now at the end of what's called the Iron Age II, after David and Solomon, after the building of the first temple. We're towards the end of the first temple period, 701 BCE, before the Babylonian exile, before the second temple, and so on. We're in the middle of 701 BCE, and it's at this time that we are dealing with the very dramatic events of 701, where on the one hand, as we saw last time, Sennacherib claims victory at Lachish and illustrates his palace, the palace without rival that he builds, which is his major architectural accomplishment, with illustrations of his victory at Lachish, the city of Lachish we spoke about last time, where the remains of the Assyrian siege ramp can still be seen. And on the other hand, we have here in Gustave Doré's illustration, the image of Sennacherib's defeat at Jerusalem. The idea of hundreds of thousands of dead Assyrians. How does this story eventuate? What is the relationship between the victory in Jerusalem and this dramatic defeat at Lachish? The other way around. What is the connection between the image of the victory at Lachish and the defeat at Jerusalem? How was Jerusalem saved? We spoke about that a little bit last time, but this evening we're going to go into it a little bit in greater detail and see how and why Jerusalem was saved and how the prophet Yeshayahu, Isaiah in English, takes that victory and makes it into something that transcends time and space. The key people we'll be discussing are Sennacherib or Sennacherib, or in Akkadian, Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, the years indicated. In the period before his reign, the kingdoms of Judah and the surrounding kingdoms were forced to pay annual tributes to Assyria. These tributes caused severe financial stress, and all the states of the region, without exception, revolted in 705 BCE, resulting in Sennacherib coming to the throne, consolidating the surrounding states, and leading a revolt in 701, leading a campaign against these revolts in 701 BCE, campaigning coming from Assyria, along the coast of the Mediterranean, and reaching Ashdod, and then threatening Jerusalem, and that will be our topic today, how and why he threatened Jerusalem. So just to show you where Assyria is located in northern Iraq. He crosses what's now Syria, comes down the coast, comes to Ashkelon, conquers Ashkelon, from there to Lachish, and threatens Jerusalem. 701 BCE. Other key people in this narrative are the prophet Isaiah, Yeshayahu, who was active in this period. He's part of the Jerusalem elite, and as we'll see, he knows political events. He is in close contact with the Jerusalem emissaries who represent the kingdom of Judah, go to Assyria, find out what's going on in Assyria, and come back and report in Jerusalem. And here in the top left corner, for those of you who didn't join us last Thursday, you see the remains of the stamp seal, which were recently found, which are inscribed with the name Yeshaya Navi, belonging to Isaiah the prophet. I think it's fairly clear that this is the stamp seal that belonged to our prophet Isaiah. This is a book I wrote about Isaiah and his use of Assyrian motifs. The last person we'll mention is the king of Judah at this time, who is in theory the opponent of this great powerful Sennacherib. Right here, Sennacherib sitting on his throne. And here is Hezekiah. For obvious reasons, we do not have a single image of Hezekiah from ancient times. All we have is a stamp seal, another stamp with which he used to mention his name, belonging to Hezekiah, the king of Judah. Thus is the stamp seal inscribed. This stamp seal was found by Eilat Mazar in Jerusalem recently. So Hezekiah, king of Judah, participates in this total revolt against Assyria starting in 705. And we know more or less what happens in this period. The new king, Sennacherib, whose inscription you see here in the The prism comes down the coast of Syria, gets to the city of Ashkelon, marked here in Akkadian as Ishkalunu, comes to Lachish, which we discussed last time, and moves from Lachish towards Jerusalem. 701 BCE, and we had this is the event in ancient times which is illustrated in the most different narratives from the ancient world. One of those illustrations, of course, are the campaign that we spoke about, the artistic illustrations of Sennacherib, where he illustrates his palace with images of his conquest of Lachish. But notice, please, that he doesn't mention Jerusalem in these illustrations. He simply mentions the conquest of Lachish and how brave he was to have conquered Lachish. That's the image of Sennacherib conquering Lachish. We saw some of those images last week. And furthermore, we see here that of all the surrounding kingdoms, only Hezekiah maintained the revolt and remained on his throne, his capital, after revolting against Sennacherib. And we spoke last week about some of the reasons for this. One reason was the city of Lachish, which absorbed the blow. And here you see an aerial view of the mound of Lachish as it looks today, with the Assyrian siege ramp still standing at the point where my cursor stands. Right, the siege ramp is right at the south end of Lachish. You can see where it stands today. We also spoke about how social cohesion, which we find of the sort we find in the Siloam tunnel inscription, helps Jerusalem survive the Assyrian threat of 701. Now, what sources of information do we have about what happened in Jerusalem? Tonight I want to focus on Jerusalem. I'm not going to discuss Lachish further, but only Jerusalem. So we have essentially four sources of information. We have Sennacherib's own inscriptions, we have archaeology, we have a short narrative in 2 Kings chapter 18, which I'll speak about tonight in some detail. And then, of course, we have the very dramatic and powerful story, which I call Isaiah's story, the prophetic story, which appears in Isaiah chapters 36 and 37, is copied from there into 2 Kings chapters 18 and 19. It's a dramatic and powerful story, and it differs in some respects from Sennacherib's inscriptions and from what we find in 2 Kings 18, chapter verses 13 to 16. And I'll show how and why we have all these different stories. We have four different sources of information, and for the next 25 minutes, we'll look at these four different sources of information. The first and simplest source of information about what Sennacherib did in Jerusalem appears in Sennacherib's own inscriptions. And here you have the image of Sennacherib's own inscriptions. And here you have the translation from the Akkadian. Of course, the inscription is in cuneiform. It's written in Akkadian. There is a very major project at the University of Pennsylvania to produce translations of each and every inscription of the Assyrian kings with a linguistic analysis, and you can Google and find the inscriptions there. This is my translation, which is substantially similar to that which you'll find at the University of Pennsylvania website. And here Sennacherib writes about Hezekiah. He says that he himself, Hezekiah, I locked him up within Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. Now this is a very common motif which we find in Assyrian inscriptions. Every time an Assyrian king fails to conquer the city of a rebel and allows the rebel to remain in his city, he claims to have locked him up like a bird in a cage. That is the standard Assyrian formulation for failure. And it indicates a failure to conquer the royal city. It is as good as admitting, I did not conquer Jerusalem. But of course, in a royal inscription, you can't say, I didn't conquer Jerusalem, because the purpose of these royal inscriptions is to glorify the Assyrian king and to say of how powerful and mighty he is, how there were none like him before, and how he is justifiably the universal monarch and ruler of the world. And therefore, it is impossible to admit that Sennacherib, in such an inscription, that Sennacherib did not conquer Jerusalem. And he simply says that he locked up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. And he continues on. I surrounded him with Assyrian forts and made it a taboo for him to leave his city gate. Sennacherib tries to cover up the idea that Hezekiah remained on his throne, was not conquered, and stayed undefeated in Akkadian Shiptsu Mitru. The proud, the obstinate, remained within Jerusalem, the only one of all the kings of the ancient Near East who survived this Assyrian campaign and remained on his throne. Only Hezekiah. The others all submit, and do not remain rebels, or are removed. Hezekiah is the only one who remains a rebel and is not removed. What is not stated here clearly is that Sennacherib, as I said, doesn't say, I didn't conquer Jerusalem. But it's clear from this inscription that he didn't conquer Jerusalem and doesn't claim to have done so either. The bird in a cage is simply a blind, a cover. And what happened when Sennacherib reached Jerusalem? Well, here we see a little bit of Hezekiah's preparations before the war. Last time we spoke about the city of David. We spoke about Hezekiah's tunnel, which you can traverse in the city of David, going roughly from this point to this point, a water tunnel of 1,200 cubits, about 600 meters, quarried through the solid rock under the city of David, in order to bring water to the city of Jerusalem within the walls of the old city, within the walls of Hezekiah's city. This marks more or less, this dotted line or dashed line marks more or less the boundaries of the city of Jerusalem as they existed in the period of Hezekiah, which were an expansion, of course, of the city of David. Here you see the city of David. Here, where my cursor is now, is the Kotel. This is the Temple Mount. And these walls are the walls Hezekiah built more or less to expand the city of Jerusalem. Now, last time we spoke about the tunnel which he built in order to allow the city to have water in a siege. That tunnel is the product of several years of work. And I spoke about how Hezekiah prepared for revolt long before he revolted. And another important remnant of Hezekiah's preparations can be seen in the middle of the old city of Jerusalem. If you're ever in the Jewish quarter, look for the little kids' playground, which is located right up here. If you can look in the slide, you can see the swing set that's over there. There's a kids' playground in the old city of Jerusalem. At the foot of the playground, there's an area where no construction has taken place because the city wanted to preserve for tourists the image of Hezekiah's wall, which was found, of course, at ground level from the time of Hezekiah by Nachman Avigad in his excavations post-67, about 53 years ago. And you can see in this construction a very, very wide wall, which was built with some haste. The wall goes through certain houses. You can see here, not very well, but when you're on site, you can see it even better. You can see the corner of a house. There's a corner of a house which was in the wall and which the builders simply barreled through and built the wall all the way around it. There was obviously a certain degree of haste. They couldn't take the time to go to build a wall farther north around the houses. The wall simply destroyed a single house. And this, of course, is recorded in the book of Isaiah. Yeshayahu mentions in chapter 22 that you destroyed houses to build the wall. There was obviously a very serious impetus to build this wall. This wall was built as the result of a program of construction in anticipation of an Assyrian attack. Sometime before 701, it's a several-year project. I would submit that Hezekiah engaged in these building projects from at least 712 BCE, building and fortifying the city of Jerusalem in order to withstand an Assyrian attack. So one piece of it is the broad wall, this wall all the way around the city, the remains of which we can see today in the old city of Jerusalem. A second piece is, of course, Hezekiah's tunnel. And the third piece, which shouldn't be ignored, is that, as you all know, an army marches on its, respond on the chat, an army marches on its, anyone? How does an army march?
Stomach.
Famous statement that the army marches on its stomach. There need to be proper supplies for the army. We can't simply rely on the army foraging. And Hezekiah prepares his army and assembles foodstuffs for his army. Now, in modern Israel, if you're familiar with how the army works, when you're in the army and you're out on a base somewhere, you will get a can of food which will have the letter tzadi stamped on it. The Hebrew letter tzadi is the first letter of the Hebrew word tzava, which means army. And it indicates that the foodstuffs in the can belong to the army. In Hezekiah's world, he didn't use the tzadi of army. He rather used the inscription belonging to the king. When he assembled foodstuffs, he would assemble the foodstuffs in a jar, not unlike the one at the bottom left of the slide, these huge jars with 4 handles on them. And the handles would have the inscription of 4 Hebrew letters: Lamed, Mem, Lamed, Kaf. In ancient Hebrew, belonging to the king, Lamelech. And under the word belonging to the king, under Lamelech, there's usually an image of a bird or a scarab, different images, perhaps relating to Egyptian imagery, perhaps relating to the expectation that the Egyptians would help Hezekiah, which they did in a very, very, very limited way. Under that, we find the name of a city, the name of one of 4 cities. Here on this seal, which is at the top right, we have an erased chet and then the letters bet, resh, nun, Hebron, indicating that this was bottled or assembled in the jar at the king's provisioning center in Hebron. Some of them have on them different city names. This one, I believe here, this is also Hebron. And some of them have on them the city name Socho, Sin, Vav, Kaf, Hey, a city located in the valley of Elah, not far, just south of modern Beit Shemesh, just south of the site of Chebet Kiafa, the city Socho, which was another provisioning center. Some are inscribed with the city Ziph, a city in the southern Judean hills, south of Hebron, not far from modern Susia. And some of them have the letters Mem, Mem, Shin, Taf, which may represent Jerusalem, the city of the king's domination, Memshelet. So we have these types of jugs with these inscriptions on them. Hundreds and hundreds of such jugs, of handles, have been found in Jerusalem, indicating a large amount of provisioning which took place in Jerusalem. And of course, jugs like this are also found at Lachish. Now, I'm going to answer the question of one of the participants about the length of Assyrian occupation, but let's get into the events a little bit more, and then we'll come back to that point. So we know that Hezekiah prepared for the revolt. We know that he built a wall around Jerusalem. We talked about the tunnel last time. We know that Sennacherib doesn't claim to have conquered Jerusalem. What else do we know from archaeology? Well, this map showing the countryside around Jerusalem can tell us an awful lot about what didn't happen when Sennacherib reached Jerusalem. Because this map shows the Jerusalem hinterland from the late 8th and early 7th centuries. And it shows many, many sites where we find excavated settlements and excavated agricultural sites. Many of the settlements are north of Jerusalem in the area called Nachal Zimri, around Pisgat Ze'ev today. The area is northwest of Jerusalem. All these excavated and salvage excavations and archaeological excavations around Jerusalem, in none of them do we find evidence of Assyrian conquest. In other words, the Assyrians in 701 certainly conquered the whole area around Lachish and devastated the area around Lachish. When the Assyrians came in 701, all the area around Lachish that I showed in last week's presentation, Lachish, Gat, Beit Shemesh, Timnah, many, many other areas in the area around Lachish, north of Lachish and south of Lachish, going as far south as Tel Beersheba, were all destroyed in 701. But when we get into the highlands, when we get into the hill country, into the mountains of Jerusalem, a very different picture emerges. All around Jerusalem, in all these farms and villages around Jerusalem, there are no destruction levels. There's no burning, there's no pillaging. The Assyrians did not destroy or occupy the area around Jerusalem. And so to the person who asked on the chat, what was the length of the Assyrian occupation of the land of Judah, I would submit as follows. In the area around Beit Shemesh, from 701 on, the area of the Shvela, from 701 on, Beit Shemesh, Lachish, all the way south to Beersheba, the whole area is destroyed, and it takes a substantial amount of time till there is a limited reconstruction, a limited opening up in our language of the area around Lachish and point south. In the area around Jerusalem, on the other hand, there is no destruction. The Assyrians did not destroy Jerusalem. They didn't devastate the surrounding area. They didn't pillage and they didn't impoverish. What did the Assyrians do? Let's look at a brief story in the book of Kings, and then at a much longer story, which I call Isaiah's story. The brief mention in the book of Kings appears here in chapter 18. It's a short, very short narrative, which I looked at with you last week, and I'll review very briefly. Hezekiah, the king of Assyria, Hezekiah, the king of Judah, sends to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, okay, I lost, but I've sinned, but you have to leave, and then I'll pay you. And then Hezekiah pays and sends them to the king of Assyria. Now, what's interesting from the Assyrian inscriptions here, and I'm comparing this with the Assyrian inscriptions, this payment takes place after the Assyrians leave. The Assyrians leave, and then Hezekiah sends payment. So that the payment is a kind of guarantee. You've showed me goodwill by leaving. I'm now showing you goodwill by paying. So there is the Assyrians do not stay, they don't devastate, they don't destroy. The dramatic story, however, doesn't appear here. In these verses, there's not much drama. Sennacherib comes, Hezekiah agrees to pay, Hezekiah pays after Sennacherib leaves. But in the story of Isaiah, we have a much more dramatic and much more antagonistic picture. And I want to explore with you this story for the next 10-15 minutes and look at why and how this story emerged. It's this dramatic story which led to the poetry of the British who write about the Assyrian came down like a wolf on a fold. It's a dramatic story which leads to the illustrations, and it's a dramatic story that leads to many, many Jewish piyutim, some of which we say at the Seder night, Ba'amartem Zevach Pesach, right? That these things happened on the night of Passover. Sennacherib came to Jerusalem. We speak about Nofef Yado. He waved his hand. The piyutim developed from this dramatic story that Isaiah tells us in Isaiah chapter 36 and 37, which are paralleled in parts of 2 Kings 18. What is the story? The story details how the Assyrians come to the gates of Jerusalem, stand at the gates, and ask the people of Jerusalem to submit. The great king Sennacherib says, on what have you relied? Have you said that strategy and achievement in war are mere words of lips? Who have you relied? First of all, he explores the possibility that they relied on Egypt. And then he says, if you will say to me, we trust in God, so you should know that God is the one whose high places and altars Hezekiah removed. And Hezekiah said to Judah and Jerusalem, worship before this altar. So there's a very interesting play here. According to the statement, Sennacherib says to the people of Jerusalem, you can't rely on God. Why not? Because Hezekiah told you to remove the altars of your God and to worship only in Jerusalem. And since you've removed the altars, your God is not being properly worshipped to. And if he's not being properly worshipped to, he's not being properly fed. And if he's a hungry God, he's not going to help you. In other words, the prophet here has a kind of satire within satire where he portrays Sennacherib laughing at the people of Jerusalem. But really, he's laughing at Sennacherib and saying, Sennacherib, you idiot, you don't know that God doesn't need food. So there's a kind of play here where Sennacherib says, if you will say to me, we trust in God, don't you know that God's altars and high places Hezekiah, the king of Judah, removed? And he said to Judah and Jerusalem, worship before this altar. But of course, Isaiah is expecting the reader to laugh at Sennacherib and say to Sennacherib, don't you know that God doesn't need food? And this is part of a large scheme of mockery of Sennacherib, which we'll see in a few more minutes. Now, this is the first speech. There are 3 different speeches. In this speech, he claims that Judah might rely on Egypt and Judah might rely on God. In the next speech, he ceases mentioning Egypt and he mentions only God. Don't let Hezekiah seduce you. Don't let Hezekiah cause you to rely on God, saying God will surely save us and the city will not be given into the hands of the king of Assyria. And he says, don't you know that no God has saved their city from my hands? Where is the god of Hamat and Arpad, Sepharvaim? All these are cities conquered by the Assyrians. No god has saved their city, and God will not save his city. So he's moved from an attack on Egypt and God to an attack primarily on God. And then he moves on to a third speech, which is entirely about God. Have the gods of the nations delivered them? My father is destroyed. Where is the king of Hamat? And so on. He's now attacking the God. He's saying there's this hierarchy in the world. The top of the hierarchy is the king of Assyria. Next on the hierarchy are the gods of the nations, among them the God of Israel. The hierarchy is king of Assyria above God. That's the attack which Hezekiah hears, which Isaiah places in the mouth of the king of Assyria. Now, this is a battle between whom and whom. This is a picture of Sennacherib, and Sennacherib is battling whom in Isaiah's dramatic rendition. Who is Sennacherib battling? He is not attacking Hezekiah here. He's not attacking Hezekiah here, except that Hezekiah might incite you. Who is the real attack being leveled against? Who is the enemy of Sennacherib here? Right? Who is the enemy of Sennacherib here? The enemy of Sennacherib here is the God of Israel. Don't rely on the God of Israel. Don't rely on YHWH. Don't rely on YHWH. Isaiah portrays this as a story about not relying on God. Now, here I want to take one more little passage from the story before I go on. I explain why Isaiah does this. In the story, there's a prayer of the king Hezekiah, King Chizkiyahu. The key element of the prayer is the last line. God, you have to save us. Why do you have to save us? You have to save us so that all the kings of the world and all the kingdoms of the world will know that you're God. And this is explained in verse 17. Listen and hear. See what Sennacherib is saying. In other words, because Sennacherib is attacking God, God has to save Jerusalem. There's a kind of balance here where Isaiah describes this as a dramatic story where only if Hezekiah's prayer is answered, where only if God saves Jerusalem, then will the world know that God is above Sennacherib. If Jerusalem falls, then Sennacherib is above God. If Jerusalem stands, then Sennacherib is subservient to God. So the question of Jerusalem's survival becomes a question of a test of supremacy between Sennacherib and God. It's a little bit like the Lord of the Rings. If you have the ring, you rule the world. Or Harry Potter. If you have the wand, you rule the world. In Hezekiah's prayer here, if God saves Jerusalem, that shows that God rules the world. If Sennacherib conquers, the opposite might be true. Now, how does Isaiah reinterpret this event? Sennacherib never came, I don't think that Sennacherib ever came to the gates of Jerusalem and said, God is not good. I don't think that Sennacherib cared about God. I don't think that Sennacherib was interested in God. What Sennacherib comes and says at the gates of Jerusalem is what he says at the gates of every city. I am great, I am powerful, I am the most powerful. And here we see a very interesting, here's a picture of Sennacherib in a banquet with all the world coming and bowing before him. And here we have a statement of how great Sennacherib is, because Sennacherib claims that he was so great because he took boards of cedar from the mountains. It's one piece of evidence of Sennacherib's greatness. And Sennacherib has another passage here where he speaks about his greatness, about how he conquered the Mount Nippur, a mountain far in the north of what's now Iraq. It's actually in Turkish territory. It's a mountain called Judida in Turkish. And up there on the mountain, he inscribed a statement and talked about how he's so powerful and so brave that he goes up through mountains. He runs through the mountains like a wild ox. He jumps on his 2 feet like a goat. He goes to the highest mountains and he sits down and drinks cold water there. The drinking of cold water in the mountains is an image of bravery in Assyrian thought. Weak men stay in the city and drink beer. Powerful men go out to the mountains and fight battles and drink water. Drink water is an image of bravery in Assyria. What does Isaiah do with these images? Look now at this little passage from the end of Isaiah 37. And Isaiah says, you, Sennacherib, denigrated God, and therefore God has to defeat you. How did you denigrate God? Look at these statements that he quotes of Sennacherib. Do these statements contain any denigration of God? What do these statements contain? Take a look at verses 24 and 25 and see if you can identify from this point, any denigration of God, and if you can figure out where Isaiah is taking these statements from. Please respond on the chat if you can. Look at verse 24 and 25. Where do we find these statements earlier? And where do we see here any denigration of God? I'm drinking water, not that I'm so brave, but I'm still drinking water. Do we find any statements here of denigration of God in this passage? Did we see these statements before? Let's take a look. And you have said, in my many chariots, I have gone up to the peaks of mountains, to the high points of Lebanon. I have cut down the heights of its cedars, its choicest junipers, and I have reached its highest peak, its lush forests. I have cooled and drunk water. There's no denigration of God here. All there is in this passage is Isaiah quoting Sennacherib. He knows that Sennacherib says, I went to the highest mountains and I drank water there. He knows that Sennacherib says, I went to mountains and I cut down boards, I cut down cedars. And so here Isaiah says, in my many chariots I have gone up to the peaks of mountains. That's exactly what Sennacherib says here. With the guards and fighting troops, I went up to the mountains. I have cut down the heights of its cedars, its choicest junipers. That's exactly what Sennacherib says here. In places where my knees became tired, I sat on the mountain boulder and drank water. That's exactly what Isaiah quotes Sennacherib as saying. I have cooled and drunk water. So all of the passage that Isaiah cites here is an actual citation of Sennacherib. Isaiah knows what Sennacherib says. He hears from the visitors from Assyria who come to Jerusalem what points of bravery the Assyrians claim. And he also knows that the Assyrians claim to have the right to rule the world. Isaiah sees this claim, the right to rule the world, as denigrating God. The Assyrians have no right to claim to denigrate God. The Assyrian claims of power are themselves denigration of God. When the Assyrians show this illustration of people bowing before King Sennacherib because they've been exiled from their city, that itself, Isaiah says, is a denigration of God. And therefore, the Assyrians must be punished. The Assyrians must have a defeat. Where's the defeat going to be? We've seen here the illustration of Assyrian victory at Lachish. Where is the defeat going to be? The defeat's going to be in Jerusalem. The fact that the Assyrians did not conquer Jerusalem is interpreted by Isaiah as evidence of Assyrian weakness and evidence of God's strength. He is interpreting political and historical events in order to give them theological meaning and saying, if the Assyrians didn't conquer Jerusalem, it means they're not all powerful. It means there are limits on them, and God is all powerful. What Assyria claimed that they ruled the world. All the areas in brown and blue belong to Assyria. Isaiah says in response, God claims to rule the world. God rules the world. The Assyrians do not actually rule. They may conquer, but they are not the rulers of the world. And so what we need in Jerusalem is the defeat. And here you have, of course, Gustave Doré's image of the many dead Assyrians in the conquest of Jerusalem. Now, I don't think that the many dead Assyrians is a historical event. I don't think that 185,000 Assyrians died, as Isaiah mentions, in the attempt to conquer Jerusalem. I think that there was a limited delegation of Assyrians who came to Jerusalem, who said, let the city surrender. Isaiah listens to them, hears them, encourages the people not to surrender. The people don't surrender, and Jerusalem stands. Jerusalem standing is a unique and important historical event because it gives people the power, the idea that Jerusalem can withstand a siege. Jerusalem withstood sieges before. It withstood the attack of Shishak. It withstood Hazael. and it withstands Sennacherib. But that withstanding is reinterpreted by Isaiah as evidence of God's control over Jerusalem. And God's victory demonstrates Jerusalem's survival. And here we see, of course, the Davidka gun, which is located along the path of Jerusalem's modern light rail, with a monument saying, with a monument behind it, with an inscription from Isaiah's story of Jerusalem's survival, with the statement, I will defend this city. V'ganoti ala yer hazot lehoshia. I will defend the city and save it for my sake, lema'ani u'lema'an David avdi. For my sake and for the sake of David. And of course, this highlights the idea of Jerusalem as a city which will withstand and outlast the siege. The end of the story in Isaiah's dramatic rendition is how the remnant of the house of Judah remains. There's recognition here, there's clear recognition that Lachish has been devastated, that the whole area of western Judah, Lachish, Bet Shemesh, all the way south to Beersheba has been devastated. But the remnant of Judah, which remains, will put forth roots below and make fruit above. And from Jerusalem, a remnant will go forth, and a remainder from the mountain of Zion. It will be a remnant and a remainder. Of course, this idea of something coming forth from Jerusalem and coming forth from the mountain of Zion is then echoed later in Isaiah chapter 2, because Isaiah chapter 2 comes after this. Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah udvar Hashem Yerushalayim. The Torah will come forth from Zion and the word of God from Jerusalem. But here, the older passage, I think, is that from Jerusalem a remnant will go forth and a remainder from the mountain of Zion. There will be a survival of Judah. The events of 701 are interpreted by Isaiah and provide a type of encouragement to the people of Jerusalem for the subsequent generations that Jerusalem can withstand the siege. Now, this is, of course, dangerous, because in 587, at the time of the destruction of the first temple, the prophet Jeremiah, who lives 110 years later, roughly, says to the people of Jerusalem, Jerusalem is now going to be destroyed. It's time to surrender. People of Jerusalem say to him, why should we surrender? there's the temple of God here. We're not going to surrender. Jerusalem will withstand the siege. Of course, Jerusalem is destroyed in 587 BCE. The first temple is destroyed. But this idea that Jerusalem is something more than a simple city, is a city that represents God's presence in the world, and that Jerusalem standing represents God's victory, emerges from the events of 701. So if last time we talked about the historical events, this time we're talking a little bit about the theology of 701, how as a result of the Assyrian campaign and the failure of the Assyrian campaign, this idea of Jerusalem standing through the generations becomes etched in Jewish memory and in the world's memory. And therefore, we have these dramatic stories about the Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold. And we have the image of the dead Assyrians that we saw earlier. And these images connect God's enduring rule with Jerusalem. I see in the chat some questions that relate to historical events. I encourage everyone to ask questions now. I'm happy to answer some of them. So Donnie Brody asked about the frame of the Assyrian occupations of the Kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem in Israel. First of all, the Assyrian, there's various stages. The Assyrians begin in around 740 BCE by demanding tribute from both Judah and the Kingdom of Israel. First from the Kingdom of Israel and then from Judah. Space of 6-7 years difference. Then both of them become kingdoms that pay tribute every year. Then in 725 or so, the Kingdom of Israel revolts. 733, the Kingdom of Israel revolts and is punished. 720 or so, the Kingdom of Israel revolts and is destroyed. Then 714, the Kingdom of Israel revolts and is punished. And then in 701, the Kingdom of Judah revolts again and is again punished but not destroyed. And I think that idea of the repeated punishment and Judah not being destroyed is extremely, extremely significant in terms of understanding the larger historical impact and larger theological echo that these events have. I'll take just two more questions here. What about what was in the jars? The jars that Hezekiah stored all around the kingdom of Judah, these Lamelech jars. The jars contain, as far as we know, basic foodstuffs, grain in some cases, wine in many cases, because wine is a basic source of sugars, and perhaps in some cases oil. But we're fairly certain that many of them contain wine. You need wine not for the liquor value, but because it's a way of getting, it's a concentrated calories. It's like your Gatorade that soldiers need when they're standing guard for days and days. The question also came up of the attribution of the construction of Hezekiah's tunnel. Hezekiah's tunnel, which runs over here. Let's see if we can get a better map. Hezekiah's tunnel, which runs over here. Hezekiah's tunnel is clearly dated to the Iron 2B. There are some who date it slightly earlier than Hezekiah and slightly later. There's a statement, someone asked why would it be dated to Menashe? The dating to Menashe is part of a larger program of slightly later dating, and it's based on a passage in Second Chronicles, which states that Hezekiah, that Menashe built a wall outside the city of Jerusalem. It's also based on a question of finding pottery, which seems to post-date the destruction of Lachish. But pottery changes don't happen so very quickly, and it would seem most reasonable that this tunnel, at least the large part of it, should be dated to the time of Hezekiah. I'm basing myself here on the larger historical picture and not only on the archaeological dates, which can be accurate to within 30 or 40 years, but cannot, absent carbon-14, even with carbon-14, we really can't be accurate to more than a 30, 40-year span. And so the statement that it's dated to Menashe or to Hezekiah has to be made based on historical considerations, and the historical considerations clearly militate in favor of dating the tunnel to the time of Hezekiah. The questions, for those of you, the person who asked about the stages of the Assyrian conquest, if you want the historical summary, you can see it in my book on Isaiah, which is called Reflections of Empire. It's, by the way, downloadable for free from the publisher's website. Any other questions that anyone would like to ask? This is a good time. How long after 701 did Judah pay tribute to Assyria? Judah continues paying tribute, as far as we know, until approximately 640 BCE. In other words, as far as we know, Judah continues to pay tribute throughout the reign of Menashe and throughout the very brief reign of his successor, Amon. Menashe comes after Hezekiah. Judah continues to pay tribute throughout those reigns. By 645 BCE, the Assyrians are in serious trouble. They are much, much weaker. And there is a large and active scholarly debate whether Judah stopped paying tribute in 640, in 630, in 625. I think that Judah stopped paying by 640 BCE. By the time Yoshiyahu comes to the throne, by the time Josiah comes to the throne, Judah is not paying tribute anymore. The Assyrians are much too preoccupied in what's going on far to the east. An interesting demonstration of that, and I'm citing here from the work of Israel F. Al, a very important biblical historian, is that at the city of Gezer, we have a document written in Akkadian. The document says, in the year after the Assyrian year, so-and-so. Now, the Assyrian year, it's mentioned in the document is, I believe, 643 BC or 644 BCE. It's already the month of Iyar in that document, and it's already the month of Sivan, the month we just started today in the Jewish calendar, which corresponds to the Assyrian calendar. It's already the month of Sivan, and the people living in Gezer don't yet know what the name of the Assyrian year is. Now, Gezer was an important Assyrian center. If they don't yet know what the Assyrian year is in the month of Sivan, it means that communications back and forth with Assyria are becoming quite weak. And that suggests that the Assyrians have lost a lot of their power. So Assyria by 640 I would doubt that they're able to exact tribute from Judah. Why did the Assyrian threat to Jerusalem fail? Was this a plague? Was this a result of water shortage? So those are all good questions. The honest truth is we can't say for certain, but it would appear to me that the Assyrians didn't really want to conquer Jerusalem. They decided that it was more worth their while to exact the tribute and to leave Jerusalem as a weak vassal state, as a tributary kingdom. There's also a transportation issue, which hasn't, I think, been adequately explored in the scholarship. Remember that the Assyrians conquered Lachish, as we saw last week, with siege machines and large engineering devices brought up against the wall. In order to conquer Jerusalem, the Assyrians would have to march those devices all the way up to Jerusalem. Now, the Assyrians may traverse the distance from Assyria to the land of Israel along a fairly well-maintained international route where they could drive their horses fairly quickly. The horses drag them. You can't drive horses in mountains. To go into the mountains, you need donkeys. That would mean that the Assyrians would have to take all their equipment, load it onto donkeys, and get the donkeys to go into the mountains. While that's not impossible, and the Assyrians do it in certain cases. They claim that they were very proud of the fact they go into the mountains. Going into the mountains is a really hard thing for them to do. And that's why they claim that it's such a result of bravery. And part of what saves Jerusalem is the difficulty the Assyrians experience in going into the mountains. There are a lot of factors. One factor is the mountains. One factor is the Assyrians aren't interested. The Assyrians have already agreed to receive tribute. But certainly Jerusalem's location in the mountains, I think, is a much more important factor than plagues or water shortages. Isaiah recounts how they wake up in the morning and they're all dead. I think that's a mashal, a prophetic image, which illustrates the Assyrians abandoning Judah and going off to their own country when they receive the tribute from Hezekiah. I hope this short talk has explored some of the issues of 701, has shown you how archaeology, together with textual study, can give us a much wider and broader perspective. All of our talks in this series are archived and available at this YouTube channel, and I'll just put that information out on the chat. But you can also simply go to our department website and look at our department website and look for our YouTube channel of our department. But I'll put it out on the chat now. Thank you to everyone for listening in. Thank you to everyone for your participation. I'm just going to put this out on the chat. Here's the address of our YouTube channel, which you can copy. Thank you to all of you, and please tune in for 2 more talks on the medieval period, which we'll be having tomorrow, and from Naama Arom and from Professor Yvonne Friedman, and then on Wednesday with a talk from Dr. Avi Pikar on Jerusalem, on Israel's Ellis Island, modern immigration to Israel. Thanks to all of you, and please be in touch by email. All the very best.
Chag Sameach.
And Chodesh Tov, and soon Chag Sameach.